A routine flight. A young woman facing silent torment. A flight attendant who must decide when to act. This is the story of how one flight became a catalyst for change, revealing the power of empathy and small acts of courage. As tensions rise and moments turn critical, how far can a simple choice ripple through lives and communities? If you enjoy stories that inspire and resonate, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts on the moments that test us and shape our character. Now join us on Flight 327, where one act changes everything. The late afternoon sun dipped low over Chicago's O'Hare International Airport, casting long shadows across the bustling terminals. Emily Carter adjusted her navy blue scarf, the official uniform accessory she'd worn for nearly 15 years, and straightened her blazer. She'd been a flight attendant long enough to understand that small details. Eye contact, a smile that reached her eyes, the tone of her voice, could make all the difference for a nervous passenger or an exhausted business traveler. Flight 327 to New York was preparing for departure, and the passengers were already gathering near the gate. A mix of harried travelers and casual flyers. Emily's eyes scanned the crowd, recognizing the familiar blend of excitement and impatience. Beside her stood John Turner, the chief flight attendant, with his hands clasped firmly behind his back. His salt-and-pepper hair and serious demeanor gave him an air of authority that Emily respected. "Looks like a full house tonight," John commented, his voice as even as always. "Full house indeed," Emily replied with a quick smile. "And we're looking at clear skies to New York." The two of them watched the final boarding call flash on the screen as the line of passengers began to thin. Among the last to board was a young woman, her gaze darting nervously as she clutched the strap of a worn leather backpack. Her dark curls framed her face, which held a hesitant expression as she searched for her seat. Emily recognized her from the passenger manifest. Jasmine Reed, age 19, traveling alone. Emily's eyes lingered on Jasmine's sleeve, where a faint stain marred the cuff of her sweater. It looked like spilled coffee or maybe ink, but the girl's self-conscious way of tugging it down seemed to signal something else. Emily stepped forward to greet her with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard," she said softly, noting the subtle tension in Jasmine's posture. The young woman nodded, her voice barely a whisper as she replied, "Thank you." Her eyes flickered downward before she moved toward her assigned seat near the middle of the plane. As the final passengers took their seats and stowed their bags, Emily continued to prepare the cabin. She greeted travelers with practiced ease, exchanging quick pleasantries and directing them to their seats. She noticed Lucy Hammond, a younger attendant who was relatively new to the airline, assisting an elderly couple a few rows ahead of Jasmine. Lucy gave Emily a quick thumbs up once the couple was settled, her enthusiasm a refreshing counterpoint to the routine professionalism of the job. Finally, the seatbelt sign chimed on, and Captain Rick Olson's voice filled the cabin with a steady reassurance. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. We're ready to depart for New York. Our flight time today will be approximately 2 hours, and we're expecting smooth conditions for the duration of our journey." Emily moved down the aisle for her final walkthrough, ensuring all seatbelts were fastened and carry-ons were secure. Her gaze drifted back to Jasmine, who sat by the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The young woman's fingers trembled slightly, and her eyes were fixed on the world outside as if she were saying a silent goodbye. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Emily returned to her jump seat, a sense of anticipation settling over her. She'd flown this route countless times, but every flight was different. Every set of passengers, a new story. She exchanged a quick nod with John, who sat across from her, his gaze steady as always. The engines roared to life, and the plane lifted smoothly into the air. Emily watched the city shrink below them, the grid of Chicago dissolving into a patchwork of green and brown fields before they climbed above the clouds. In a matter of minutes, the familiar chime announced that the seatbelt sign had been turned off, and Emily rose from her seat to begin the in-flight service. Emily pushed the beverage cart through the narrow aisle, moving with the ease of experience as she served drinks and snacks. The routine felt grounding, a comforting rhythm that allowed her to stay alert to her surroundings. Passengers exchanged quiet conversation, and the hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin. About halfway through her service, Emily noticed Jasmine sitting stiffly in her seat, her hands still clutching the hem of her sweater. The two men in the row in front of her, who had been speaking in low voices, suddenly erupted in laughter. One of them, a silver-haired man in his mid-50s, glanced back at Jasmine with a smirk before returning to his conversation. The other man, who wore a watch that gleamed under the cabin lights, chuckled along, but his gaze held an unsettling undertone. Emily's attention sharpened. She sensed something off about the way the men were acting, a vague condescension in their glances, and a shared smirk that hinted at a private joke at someone else's expense. Jasmine seemed to shrink further into her seat, her eyes fixed firmly on the window as though she could will herself invisible. When Emily reached Jasmine's row, she paused. "Would you like something to drink?" she offered, her voice gentle. Jasmine looked up, her face pale. She hesitated, casting a quick glance toward the men in front of her before shaking her head. "No, thank you," she murmured. "Let me know if you need anything," Emily added, offering a reassuring smile. Jasmine nodded but remained tense, her gaze falling back to her lap. As Emily continued down the aisle, her concern for Jasmine only grew. Years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and something about this situation felt wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that Jasmine was silently battling something deeper than typical travel anxiety. The tension between the young woman and the men seated in front of her hinted at an undercurrent Emily was determined to understand. The rest of the flight carried on without incident, but the atmosphere around Jasmine remained tense. The men continued their low, mocking laughter, punctuated with sideways glances that made Emily's chest tighten with frustration. She kept a close eye on Jasmine, noticing each nervous fidget, each furtive glance toward the aisle. When Jasmine eventually rose from her seat to head toward the restroom, Emily felt a surge of protective instinct. She glanced at the men, who exchanged another smirk before one of them stood, stretching his arms with exaggerated leisure before heading in the same direction. Emily's unease grew as she watched him move down the aisle toward the rear lavatory where Jasmine had gone. She glanced at John, who was busy checking on the other passengers. She wanted to follow but hesitated, aware that it might be seen as overstepping protocol. Yet every fiber of her being told her to intervene. Finally, after a moment's hesitation, Emily made her way toward the back of the plane. She reached the lavatory area just in time to hear a muffled voice, Jasmine's, followed by a low, taunting reply from the man. Emily's heart raced as she knocked on the door, her voice firm. "Is everything all right in there?" There was a moment of silence, and then the man's voice replied, casual and dismissive. "Just stretching my legs, miss. No need to worry." But Emily wasn't convinced. She stood her ground, waiting until the man stepped out, his expression smug as he returned to his seat. Jasmine emerged a moment later, her face pale and eyes downcast. She managed a quiet, "Thank you," before slipping back to her seat. Emily's hands tightened around the handle of the beverage cart as she watched Jasmine walk away, a simmering anger rising within her. She could no longer ignore the undercurrent of intimidation and mockery. It was time to speak with John and ensure that action was taken. The murmurs of the passengers, the whirring of the plane's engines, and the intermittent flicker of the seatbelt sign provided the backdrop as Emily returned to her jump seat for a brief pause. The brief encounter outside the lavatory had left her on edge. Her trained smile faltered for just a moment as she exhaled, eyes fixed on the subtle movements in the cabin. Lucy, busy handing out napkins and adjusting trays a few rows away, caught Emily's eye and mouthed, "Everything okay?" Emily nodded quickly, but a shadow of concern lingered on her colleague's face. John Turner, who had just completed a check of the emergency kits, approached Emily. His brows drew together as he noted the tension in her posture. "Emily, you look like you've seen a ghost," he said, half joking. She glanced back at the rear of the plane, where Jasmine sat, visibly hunched and avoiding eye contact with anyone. "I think we need to keep an eye on the passengers in 14B and 14C, Emily whispered. One of them followed Jasmine to the restroom. I intervened, but there's something off. John's expression shifted, the professional mask slipping to reveal a flicker of worry. Did anything happen? He asked, his tone suddenly serious. Not that I could confirm, but it felt wrong, Emily admitted. We're trained to read people, right? Well, they're making her uncomfortable, and I can't ignore it. John nodded, processing her words. His eyes scanned the cabin, settling briefly on the two men. They were engrossed in conversation again, but their laughter was muted, accompanied by the occasional backward glance at Jasmine. Let's stay vigilant, John said, shifting back to his composed self. If it escalates, we'll need to step in officially. For now, keep an eye on them, and I'll inform Captain Olson. Emily felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The recognition from John validated her instincts, even if it was just a first step. She resumed her duties with renewed focus, moving through the rows, aware of every sound and every subtle shift in the passengers' behavior. As the evening deepened, the plane settled into a calm hum. Overhead lights dimmed, leaving only the soft glow from personal reading lamps. Passengers who weren't already asleep or engaged in movies adjusted their seats for rest. Emily approached the back galley, where Lucy had just finished stowing away the last of the meal trays. "Everything all right?" Lucy asked, breaking the silence with her usual upbeat voice. "Just a bit tense tonight," Emily said, her eyes drifting to Jasmine's brow. "That girl in 16A, Jasmine, has been having a rough time." Lucy glanced over, noting Jasmine's still posture and the subtle flinch whenever a passenger or flight attendant passed. "She does look like she's carrying the weight of the world," Lucy said. She hesitated before adding, "The guys in front of her seem, I don't know, off?" "That's what I thought," Emily replied, a touch of satisfaction warming her tone. The shared perception reinforced her concerns. Suddenly, a sharp metallic clatter sounded from a few rows up, followed by a snide laugh. Emily's head snapped in that direction, heart thudding as she saw one of the men, 14B, the one with the silver hair, casually tossing a small, crumpled piece of paper behind him. It bounced off the corner of Jasmine's armrest, landing by her feet. The girl stiffened, eyes darting to the paper before she glanced up, searching for someone who might intervene. Emily stepped forward, her movements swift but measured. "Everything all right here?" she asked, forcing an air of calm into her voice. The man turned, his smirk slipping momentarily into surprise before he resumed a lazy expression. "Of course, miss," he drawled, leaning back in his seat with a practiced nonchalance. His companion chuckled quietly, eyes flicking between Emily and Jasmine. Emily bent down and picked up the paper. Jasmine's gaze met hers, wide and tinged with relief and embarrassment. Emily gave her a small nod, communicating without words. "I see you, and I'm here." Straightening, she turned to the men, her expression hardening subtly. "Let's keep things respectful," she said, her voice low enough to avoid drawing attention, but firm enough to leave no room for ambiguity. The man's smile thinned, but he said nothing, turning back to his conversation with an air of indifference. Jasmine exhaled shakily, shifting in her seat as Emily returned to the galley. Lucy's eyes were wide, her hands stilling on the counter. "That was, unacceptable," Emily finished. She exchanged a look with Lucy, both of them understanding the weight of what lay beneath the surface of their otherwise routine flight. The rest of the shift passed with an uneasy truce. The plane coasted smoothly over darkened landscapes, the occasional burst of turbulence sending light tremors through the cabin. Emily checked on passengers, her interactions polite but focused, her mind always drifting back to Jasmine and the men in 14B and 14C. When Jasmine stood to visit the restroom again, Emily's heart skipped a beat. This time she was ready. She moved to the back of the plane, ensuring that the path remained clear and discreetly positioning herself where she could intervene quickly if needed. But Jasmine's trip was brief, and she returned to her seat without incident. As she passed, Emily caught her eye, offering a reassuring nod. Jasmine's lips quirked into a half-smile, fleeting but genuine. It was a small victory, but in that moment it felt significant. Lucy approached Emily after the cabin had quieted down again. "Should we tell John about what happened earlier with the paper?" she asked, her voice soft. "Not yet," Emily replied, glancing over at John, who was reviewing safety protocols at the front of the plane. "But we're going to stay close. If it escalates again, we'll make sure he knows." Lucy nodded, her youthful face set with determination. They both knew that small acts of vigilance could mean the difference between a safe flight and a moment that spiraled out of control. The hours inched by, marked by the shifting positions of sleeping passengers and the glow of seatbelt signs flickering on during brief bouts of turbulence. Emily felt her muscles ache with tension, but she refused to let herself relax fully. Every sound, every movement carried weight. The glances between the men in 14B and 14C had slowed, their attention waning as the flight neared its descent. But the tension they'd sown still lingered. Jasmine closed her eyes, head leaning against the window, and for the first time since they'd taken off, Emily saw her shoulders lower, just slightly. Emily allowed herself a moment of relief but kept her senses alert, knowing that even the calmest flights could change in an instant. The plane continued eastward, cutting through the dark sky like an arrow, its passengers caught between the solitude of the night and the anticipation of their arrival in New York. And as the final hour of the flight approached, Emily prepared herself for whatever came next, determined that no one would face it alone. The city lights of New York, still distant but glowing like a constellation against the horizon, signaled that Flight 327 was approaching its final leg. The passengers, lulled by hours of steady flight, stirred as announcements about arrival preparations filled the cabin. Emily Carter scanned the rows, noting the weary faces, the barely stifled yawns, and the shift from quiet restfulness to anticipation. But Emily's focus kept returning to the young woman in seat 16A. Jasmine sat rigidly, the soft blue glow of the reading light casting shadows across her face. Every so often her eyes flicked to the men in 14B and 14C, who were now quiet but carried an aura of smugness, their whispers replaced by an air of calm superiority. Something about their stillness put Emily on edge, like the lull before a storm. John Turner walked by, clipboard in hand, as if checking items off an invisible list. "We're getting close," he said, pausing beside Emily. His voice, though professional, held a note of weariness. "Everything seems fine on the surface, but those two in 14B and 14C haven't been," Emily said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. They were throwing things earlier, just small scraps of paper, but they made Jasmine visibly nervous. John's eyes narrowed, glancing quickly toward the row in question. He sighed, the creases in his forehead deepening. "Let's hope it stays quiet. But if something happens, we're ready." As John moved on, Emily felt both reassured and frustrated. The crew's commitment was clear, but there was an unspoken rule in flight service. Handle things discreetly. Avoid escalation unless absolutely necessary. It was a delicate dance between intervention and observation, one Emily knew all too well. Emily approached Jasmine's row again under the guise of collecting any remaining trash or cups. The young woman's eyes met hers, wide with a silent question. Emily leaned slightly, her voice a low murmur. "We're almost there. Just hang in a bit longer." Jasmine nodded, the movement stiff and uncertain. She glanced down at her lap, where her hands were clasped tightly together, the knuckles white. The man in 14B, with his silver hair gleaming under the cabin lights, shifted in his seat. He turned slightly, just enough for Emily to catch the sly flick of his eyes toward Jasmine. There was a brief predatory amusement there, as if he relished the discomfort he caused. Emily's jaw clenched, and she forced herself to keep moving, acknowledging the looks from passengers who had become vaguely aware that something was amiss. Lucy appeared at the end of the aisle, her expression reflecting the same tension that coiled in Emily's chest. "Did you see that?" Lucy whispered when Emily reached her. "Yes. We need to stay close," Emily replied. The two exchanged a glance that confirmed their silent understanding. They weren't going to let anything slide. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and Captain Olson's voice came over the intercom, his tone steady but edged with the energy that signaled a descent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial approach into New York. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Emily watched as the passengers complied. The men in 14B and 14C resumed their quiet conversation, a smirk passing between them, while Jasmine pressed her back into her seat, eyes closed as if bracing herself. As the descent continued, a ripple of turbulence shook the cabin. It was mild, the sort of bump that usually elicited little more than a few startled glances, but tonight the atmosphere in the plane felt different. Emily noticed Jasmine's hand twitch involuntarily, her fingers moving to grip the armrest. A wave of protectiveness surged through Emily, who stood poised to step in if needed. A sudden snicker from 14B cut through the cabin's quiet, followed by a muttered comment that Emily couldn't fully hear but could sense was loaded with disdain. The noise drew the attention of nearby passengers, a few of whom shifted uncomfortably. Emily exchanged a sharp glance with Lucy, who had started down the aisle with a tray of empty glasses. Lucy's eyes, wide and questioning, met Emily's as if to say, "Do we step in now?" John, who had positioned himself near the front of the plane, noticed the subtle disturbance. He approached quietly, stopping by Emily's side. "Everything all right back here?" he asked, his tone neutral but pointed. Before Emily could answer, a small piece of paper sailed from 14B and landed directly on Jasmine's tray table. She flinched, eyes snapping open, and a collective tension rippled through the surrounding rows. The silence that followed felt deafening. "That's enough," John said, his voice finally breaking the quiet. His eyes fixed on the man in 14B, whose smirk faltered. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to refrain from further disruption." The man's expression darkened, shifting from amused to irritated. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then seemed to reconsider, settling back with a dramatic sigh. "Just having a bit of fun," he muttered, turning to his companion, who chuckled dryly. Jasmine's gaze darted around, landing briefly on Emily before lowering again. The cabin seemed to hold its breath as passengers exchanged glances, some curious, others frowning in quiet judgment. "Let's keep things calm as we approach our destination," John added, his eyes sweeping the cabin. Satisfied that order had been restored for the moment, he moved on, but Emily's eyes remained locked on Jasmine, who had begun to relax her death grip on the armrest. The remaining minutes of the descent were marked by a strained silence. Emily made her way to the back of the cabin, where she watched with a sense of vigilance that bordered on exhaustion. The plane dipped smoothly through layers of clouds, the lights of the city below spreading like a sprawling quilt. A tap on her arm drew her attention. Lucy stood beside her, eyes reflecting worry. "Emily, are we doing enough?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Emily's answer was slow, deliberate. "We're watching, and we're ready. Sometimes that's all we can do until it matters most." The plane gave a final jolt as it aligned with the runway, the cabin lights brightening as they prepared for landing. Emily's gaze swept over the passengers one last time, noting the quiet hum of anticipation, the subtle adjustments of seatbelts, and the hands gripping armrests. Jasmine had opened her eyes and was sitting more upright now, a thread of hope woven through her fear. The wheels touched down with a thud, and the plane glided along the runway, slowing as it approached the gate. The collective sigh of relief that followed was almost palpable, the kind of sound that marked the end of one journey and the beginning of the next. As the seatbelt sign switched off and passengers stirred, Emily prepared herself for what would come next. The confrontation in the air had passed without a major incident, but the tension it had left behind needed resolution. Jasmine caught Emily's eye and offered a small, tired smile. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The buzz of conversation returned as passengers unbuckled their seatbelts and stood, stretching cramped limbs. The overhead compartments clattered open, and suitcases were jostled free with the usual impatience. The chaos of arrival was in full swing, but for Emily, the weight in her chest hadn't lifted. Her eyes lingered on Jasmine, who sat motionless as people shuffled past her, shoulders hunched as though trying to make herself smaller. The men in 14B and 14C were taking their time gathering their belongings. The silver-haired man glanced at Jasmine one last time, an amused glint still in his eyes, before turning away to speak to his companion. Emily's jaw tightened. There was something about that look, something insidious that made her hands curl into fists at her sides. John Turner moved through the cabin, offering a polite smile to passengers as they disembarked. When he reached Emily, he paused, taking in her tense posture. "Keep an eye on them," he murmured, nodding subtly toward the two men. Emily didn't need to be told twice. The final passengers filed out, and soon the cabin was left in a state of half-empty quiet. The sound of rolling suitcases faded down the jet bridge, leaving only the hum of the aircraft systems. Jasmine stood slowly, adjusting the strap of her backpack as if she needed the motion to anchor herself. Her eyes met Emily's briefly, a mix of exhaustion and gratitude in their dark depths. "Take care, Jasmine," Emily said softly. The young woman's lips parted as if she wanted to say more, but instead she nodded and stepped past, her movements cautious and deliberate. Lucy approached, her expression reflecting the same tired worry Emily felt. "I hope she's okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She will be," Emily replied, more as a reassurance to herself than anything else. Back in the terminal, Jasmine moved through the crowd with the detachment of someone whose mind was somewhere else. The announcement of connecting flights droned over the loudspeakers, mingling with the chatter of travelers and the metallic clatter of luggage. A sudden familiar laugh behind her sent a shiver down her spine. She turned instinctively and caught sight of the silver-haired man and his companion heading toward the exit, their backs now to her. Relief coursed through her, but it was tinged with the raw residue of anger and fear. The memory of their taunts and mocking looks clung to her like a second skin. "Jasmine!" The voice startled her out of her thoughts. A middle-aged woman with a neat bob and an airline badge approached, her expression both warm and concerned. "I'm Monica Lewis from the airline's passenger services. We just wanted to check in and make sure you're all right after the flight." Jasmine nodded, forcing herself to meet the woman's gaze. "I'm okay," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The offer of concern felt like a lifeline, something tangible after hours of pretending she was fine. Monica's smile was sympathetic. "If you'd like, we can file a report or document what happened. It's up to you." Jasmine hesitated. The idea of putting her experience into words, of confronting what had just happened, was daunting. But then she remembered Emily's small nods of encouragement, the moments when she felt seen, protected. Jasmine squared her shoulders. "Yes, I think I'd like to do that." Meanwhile, back on the plane, Emily and Lucy worked to complete their post-flight checks, the two men's departure leaving a lingering tension. Emily couldn't shake the look of triumph on the silver-haired man's face as he passed by. It made her stomach churn with a mix of frustration and guilt for not being able to do more. "Did you see them leave?" Lucy asked, leaning against the galley counter. "I did," Emily replied, "and I didn't like what I saw." Lucy nodded slowly, worry flickering in her eyes. "Do you think she's going to be okay?" "Jasmine, I mean. She has more strength than she realizes," Emily said, though the words felt hollow. It was something she wanted to believe, needed to believe, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. John approached, clipboard under his arm. His eyes moved between the two attendants, reading the unease on their faces. "I spoke with the captain and logged the details of the incident. It's out of our hands now, but if there's any follow-up, the airline will handle it." Emily swallowed the knot in her throat, nodding. "I hope so, John. I really do." Jasmine sat in a small office tucked away from the main terminal, the hum of airport life muted by the thick walls. Monica placed a glass of water in front of her and handed her a simple form to fill out. "Take your time," she said, offering a reassuring pat on Jasmine's hand before stepping away to give her space. Jasmine looked down at the paper, its blank lines staring back at her, challenging her to turn her fear into coherent sentences. She hesitated, the pen hovering over the page before she started to write. Each word felt like a release, pulling the weight of silence from her chest. "Two men harassed me during the flight. They made jokes at my expense, threw things, and followed me to the restroom." The flight attendant noticed and intervened. By the time she finished, her hands trembled less, and her breathing felt deeper, freer. Monica returned, reading over the statement with a thoughtful nod. "This is a good start. We'll keep you informed about any follow-up actions." Jasmine's eyes met Monica's, a spark of determination replacing some of the exhaustion. "And thank you," she said. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of something she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge during the flight. A sense of reclaiming control. Emily sat in the crew lounge, the hum of conversation around her doing little to distract from her thoughts. She replayed the flight in her mind, the subtle and overt moments of hostility, the choices she'd made, and the looks exchanged. Every detail felt imprinted on her, each decision scrutinized and analyzed in the solitude of her thoughts. Lucy dropped into the chair next to her, exhaling loudly. "You did what you could, Emily. Don't let it eat you up." Emily turned to look at her, the younger woman's earnest expression softening the tightness in her chest. "I know," Emily said, a small smile ghosting her lips, "but I can't help feeling that we should have done more." Lucy placed a hand on Emily's arm. "We watched, we intervened when we could, and we stayed close. That matters, and I have a feeling this isn't the end of the story." The words resonated in Emily's mind, echoing like a promise she hadn't yet made to herself. A promise to see this through, whatever came next. As she stood to leave the lounge, ready to step back into the familiar chaos of the airport, Emily felt the weight shift slightly. It wasn't gone, but it was lighter, and that was enough for now. Jasmine sat in the back of the rideshare car, watching as the lights of New York flickered by, their reflections dancing on the wet pavement. The city's energy, normally exhilarating, felt overwhelming tonight. The events on Flight 327 replayed in her mind, sharp and insistent. The men's laughter, the taunting whispers, and the weight of eyes on her when she wished she could disappear. Her phone buzzed with a notification, pulling her out of her thoughts. A message from her mother. "Let me know when you're home safe, sweetheart. Love you." Jasmine's fingers hovered over the screen before she typed a quick reply, promising to call once she was settled. In the silence that followed, she let her thoughts drift to the flight attendant with kind eyes and steady hands. Emily had seemed like a lifeline, a small beacon of safety in the confined cabin. Jasmine breathed out slowly, a sense of gratitude softening the edges of her anxiety. Back at the airline's headquarters the following morning, Emily sat across from John in a meeting room. The airline had requested that crew members involved in incidents submit detailed debriefs. It was an uncomfortable but necessary part of the job. "Start from the beginning, Emily," John said, his tone firm but supportive. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, the sterile room offering no comfort. Emily recounted the moments from the flight, the subtle signs of Jasmine's discomfort, the antagonistic behavior of the men, and the small interventions she'd made. As she spoke, she felt the frustration resurface. She remembered the way her chest tightened each time she'd passed Jasmine's row, knowing something was wrong but feeling constrained by protocol. John nodded thoughtfully. "You handled it well. We're trained for these situations, but we can't predict every outcome. The report will help, and the airline will follow up with passenger statements." "I just hope that it's enough," Emily said, her voice softer now, a trace of doubt lingering. The words hung between them, heavy with the understanding that safety on a flight was as much about vigilance as it was about reaction. A week passed, and the memory of Flight 327 began to settle into the edges of Emily's thoughts. But the incident hadn't faded into obscurity. It had started to surface in ways she hadn't expected. Passengers on subsequent flights seemed more watchful, eyes flicking around as if noticing the tension that could exist between strangers. Emily caught snippets of conversations that hinted at the recent news coverage, an article about an airline incident involving bias and passenger safety. One afternoon, Emily received an email from Monica Lewis in passenger services. The subject line read, "Follow-up on Flight 327, Media Inquiry." Her stomach flipped as she opened it. The message outlined a request from a local news station to speak with crew members involved in the flight. Noting that Jasmine had given a brief statement to the press, Jasmine spoke out, Emily thought, a mix of surprise and admiration washing over her. The knowledge that the young woman had found her voice gave Emily a sense of fulfillment she hadn't expected. But it also meant that the story wasn't over. Jasmine stared at her laptop screen, the article about the flight filling the page. The headline was simple, yet powerful. Standing Up in the Skies, a story of courage on flight. 3 on 27. The journalist had woven Jasmine's account with those of other passengers, focusing on the silent dynamics that had played out and the subtle, persistent way that Emily had intervened. The comments section was a mix of supportive voices and those who questioned the severity of the situation. Jasmine's pulse quickened as she scrolled through, stopping on a comment that read, "It's easy to ignore things like this if they don't happen to you. But we need to support each other, even when it's uncomfortable." She clicked like on the comment, a sense of validation seeping into her. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was her roommate, Sarah, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a smile. "I figured you'd need a pick-me-up," she said, handing Jasmine a cup before settling into the chair across from her. "Thanks," Jasmine said, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. The familiar scent grounded her as she took a sip. Sarah's eyes darted to the screen, taking in the article. "So, you're really doing this, talking about what happened?" Jasmine nodded slowly. "I didn't plan to, but I couldn't just let it go. People need to know that these things happen, even in places where you're supposed to feel safe." Sarah's expression softened, pride mingling with concern. "You're brave, you know that?" Jasmine managed a small smile. "I'm trying to be." The airline's response to the growing attention was swift. A memo circulated among employees detailing the company's commitment to reviewing its protocols on handling discrimination and harassment. Crew members were encouraged to attend a voluntary meeting to discuss best practices and share feedback. Emily arrived at the meeting room, surprised to find it already filled with attendants, pilots, and even ground staff. The room buzzed with quiet conversation. Lucy spotted her and waved her over to an empty chair near the front. "Did you hear?" Lucy whispered. "They're considering adding new training sessions focused on recognizing and handling subtle forms of bias." Emily nodded. "It's overdue," she said, the words tinged with hope. John stepped up to the front of the room, clipboard in hand. His eyes swept over the gathered staff, his expression serious but not unkind. "We're here because we know that our job isn't just about getting people from one place to another. It's about ensuring that every passenger feels safe and respected," he began. "The events on Flight 327 reminded us that vigilance and empathy are as crucial as any safety protocol." Emily felt a shift in the room, a collective acknowledgement of the weight of their responsibilities. The meeting continued, voices rising as crew members shared stories of similar incidents, moments that had passed with little more than an uneasy glance. The sharing brought a sense of unity, an understanding that their actions, however small, could change the outcome for someone like Jasmine. As the meeting wound down, Emily found herself approached by Monica Lewis. "Emily, would you be open to speaking at the employee seminar next month? We're putting together a panel on handling discrimination and would love your insight." Emily's initial reaction was hesitation. She wasn't used to public speaking, preferring the quiet, behind-the-scenes work of her job. But then she thought of Jasmine and the way the young woman had bravely shared her story. "Yes," she said, surprising even herself. "I'd be honored to." Monica's face lit up with approval. "Great! We'll work out the details later, but thank you. Your perspective is invaluable." As Emily walked out of the meeting room, Lucy caught up with her, grinning. "Look at you, becoming an advocate." Emily chuckled, the sound laced with nerves. "It feels right," she admitted. "If sharing what happened helps others be more aware, then it's worth it." They walked out into the hallway together. The weight of what they had witnessed on Flight 327 now transformed into something that felt closer to hope. The following weeks were filled with preparation. Emily wrote down key moments from the flight, reflecting on the choices she'd made and the training that had guided her. She reached out to Jasmine, who had continued to share her experiences with small groups and community organizations. Their conversations were tentative at first, bridging the gap between the roles they'd played during the flight. One protector, one survivor. But soon, they discovered a shared commitment to making sure no one felt alone in those moments. "I'm glad you're speaking at the seminar," Jasmine said over a phone call one evening. More people need to hear how these things unfold and how they can step up. Thank you, Emily said. It feels less daunting knowing that you're already out there doing the same. Their words carried weight, but also lightness, like stepping into the next chapter with a sense of purpose. The day of the seminar arrived, and Emily found herself pacing backstage, the quiet hum of voices filtering through the curtain. She clutched the note cards she'd prepared, although she knew most of her speech by heart. It was a strange feeling, standing on the precipice of sharing a moment that had been so intense and personal with a room full of people who would soon analyze it through their own lenses. "Relax, you'll do great," said Lucy, who had come for moral support. She wore a grin that was equal parts teasing and encouraging. Emily nodded, the warmth of her colleagues' presence steadying her. The crowd, composed of flight crew, airline administrators, and a few members of the press, quieted as John Turner stepped up to the podium to introduce the session. His voice, usually clipped and efficient, took on a softer tone as he spoke of the importance of vigilance and empathy on every flight. "Today, we have someone whose actions embodied those very principles," John said, turning to look at Emily. "Please welcome Emily Carter." A smattering of applause followed, polite but filled with curiosity. Emily took a deep breath and stepped forward, the note cards trembling slightly in her hands. The lights were bright, and for a moment, the faces in the audience were a blur. But then she saw Jasmine sitting in the front row, her expression open and encouraging. It's anchored Emily, grounding her in the purpose of her words. "I'm here to tell you about a moment that started as an ordinary flight, but turned into something far more complicated," Emily began. The room settled into silence, the weight of anticipation palpable. Emily recounted the details of Flight 327, the subtle signs, the moments when she'd had to choose between adhering to protocol and listening to her instincts. She spoke of the silent tension, the low laughter, the piece of paper that had landed on Jasmine's tray. She paused to let her words sink in, scanning the faces in the crowd. Many of us have been in situations where we felt something wasn't right, but weren't sure how to act, Emily said, her voice gaining strength. "What I learned that day is that sometimes acting is as simple as acknowledging the moment, being present, and showing support. Even when it feels small, it can mean everything to someone who feels alone." There were nods in the audience, some furrowed brows as listeners absorbed the weight of her experience. Emily noticed a few flight attendants exchanging glances, a shared understanding passing between them. Jasmine stood when Emily concluded, applause breaking out as she walked to the podium. "I wanted to add something," Jasmine said, her voice calm but resonant. "What Emily did that day didn't just make me feel seen. It reminded me that even in moments when I felt powerless, there were people willing to stand with me." The room erupted in applause, this time warmer, more resonant. The seminar shifted from just another corporate session to a meaningful dialogue about the human element behind safety and protocol. The impact of the seminar was immediate. Attendees approached Emily and Jasmine afterward, sharing their own stories of silent support or moments when they wished they'd spoken up. Lucy hovered nearby, a proud smile on her face as she exchanged words with colleagues. "I didn't realize how many of us have had experiences like this," Lucy said to Emily, once the crowd thinned. "It makes you think about how we can be better prepared." "Exactly," Emily replied, a feeling of hope unfurling in her chest. "It's not just about big actions, it's the small ones that add up." Monica Lewis, the representative from passenger services who had first spoken to Jasmine after the flight, approached with a knowing smile. "You've done something powerful today," she said. "This is only the beginning." The days following the seminar were a whirlwind of feedback and new developments. The airline began to formalize plans for additional training programs, drawing on the feedback from crew members who had attended. Emily was asked to participate in the development of these modules, offering first-hand insight into real-world situations that required both empathy and action. Jasmine, buoyed by the response at the seminar, began receiving invitations to speak at other events. She agreed to participate in a local community panel on combating subtle discrimination, where she shared her story alongside other advocates. The experience was nerve-wracking but affirming. With each retelling, Jasmine felt her confidence grow, the raw edges of fear slowly dulling as they were replaced by purpose. At one of these events, a high school student approached Jasmine, eyes wide with curiosity. "Hearing you talk about what happened made me realize it's okay to speak up," the student said. "I've been quiet too many times." Jasmine's heart swelled. "It's not always easy, but you're stronger than you think," she replied, the words resonating with an echo of Emily's quiet support from the plane. Emily's life shifted as well. What had once been a straightforward career path took on new layers. She continued to fly regularly, but now her job held a different weight. Passengers recognized her from news stories, some offering quiet nods or a simple "thank you" as she passed down the aisle. One afternoon, while prepping for a routine flight, a fellow attendant, Alex, a tall man with a reassuring smile, approached her. "I watched the seminar you spoke at," he said, pulling a headset over his ears. "It made me think about a time I hesitated to act, and I promised myself I wouldn't do that again." Emily smiled, the compliment warming her more than she expected. "We all learn as we go," she said. "I'm glad it made a difference." The flight itself was uneventful, the best kind of flight. But as Emily walked the aisles, she noticed small things. A passenger helping another lift a heavy bag. A child offering their headphones to a sibling who had forgotten theirs. Simple acts of kindness that felt magnified now that she was attuned to them. Jasmine's advocacy work continued to gain momentum. She joined forces with a nonprofit that focused on promoting awareness in public spaces. Schools, transportation hubs, community centers. Each new speaking engagement brought a mix of nerves and fulfillment. One evening, Emily received a message from Jasmine. "Speaking at a community center tomorrow. Would love to have you there, if you're free." The next evening, Emily sat in a folding chair at the back of the community center, watching as Jasmine addressed a group of teenagers. The room was bright, full of noise and movement that settled as Jasmine began speaking. Her voice was clear, her words heartfelt. She described the moments on the plane when she felt most alone, and how one person's quiet determination had changed everything for her. "And what I learned," Jasmine said, eyes sweeping the room, "is that being brave doesn't mean being fearless. It means acting even when you are." Emily felt a lump in her throat as applause filled the space. Jasmine's eyes caught hers from across the room, a silent thank you passing between them. Emily nodded, her heart swelling with pride and something deeper, a sense of purpose that extended beyond the cabin of any plane. The ripple effect of the Flight 327 incident had transformed from a moment of shared silence and tension into a wider narrative that resonated beyond the airline industry. Media outlets continued to cover the story, focusing on the airline's efforts to implement new policies and the personal accounts of those involved. Emily watched as discussions about discrimination and allyship became topics on news segments and social media posts. One afternoon, she sat at her small dining table, scrolling through an online article about the seminar she had spoken at. The headline read, "Flight Attendants' Quick Thinking Sparks Change in Airline Protocols." Emily's phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text from her brother, Mark. "Saw the article. Proud of you, sis. You've always had that fire in you." A smile played at her lips. Mark's words stirred memories of their childhood, moments when she'd stood up for kids being teased at school or volunteered at community events. This was who she had always been, but Flight 327 had magnified it, giving her actions a platform she hadn't anticipated. Across the city, Jasmine was finding herself in new territory. The speaking engagements were becoming more frequent, and she felt her voice grow stronger with each one. But with visibility came scrutiny. The article comments were a mixed bag, overwhelmingly positive, but a few stood out with sharp, questioning tones. Was it really that serious? And people are too sensitive these days. Jasmine sat with her laptop, debating whether to engage or let it go. Sarah, her roommate, peered over her shoulder. "You're not going to respond to those, are you?" "I don't know," Jasmine admitted. "Part of me wants to explain, but part of me knows it won't make a difference." Sarah sighed, setting down her coffee. "You've already made a difference. It's not your job to convince everyone. You've said your piece, and people who need to hear it will listen." Jasmine closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, Sarah's words echoing in her mind. She thought of Emily's unwavering presence on the plane, a silent ally who hadn't needed to explain herself to make an impact. Jasmine decided to focus on those who listened, who reached out with stories of their own experiences. Emily's role in the airline's new training programs evolved from participant to contributor. She worked alongside Monica Lewis and other representatives from the airline's training department to develop a curriculum that focused on recognizing subtle signs of distress and building confidence in stepping in. One afternoon, Emily found herself in a conference room with Monica, surrounded by papers, binders, and presentation slides. Monica pushed her reading glasses up her nose and glanced over a checklist. "We're almost there, but we need to include an interactive component, something that puts the crew in a real-life scenario." Emily considered this. "What if we use case studies like what happened with Jasmine? We can walk the crew through different responses and talk about how to de-escalate situations without confrontation, but with presence." Monica nodded, a smile breaking across her face. "That's exactly what we need. This way, everyone gets a sense of what it's like to be on that plane, in that moment." The first training session was set for the following week, and Emily was prepared to co-lead it. The room was filled with crew members of varying experience levels. Some wore expressions of mild curiosity, others of weary cynicism. Emily stood at the front of the room, noting the skepticism in the eyes of a few older attendants who had seen it all. "Good morning, everyone," Emily began, her voice steady but warm. "Today, we're going to talk about vigilance, not just as a response to emergencies, but as a proactive way of creating a safe environment for all passengers." She could see a few doubtful glances shift into thoughtful ones as she walked them through the timeline of Flight 327. Using case studies, she described the moments when small actions, like making eye contact, checking in discreetly, and observing interactions, could shift a situation from potential harm to safety. Lucy assisted by leading a role-play exercise, guiding groups of attendants through different scenarios. The room buzzed with newfound energy as people discussed the fine line between overstepping and showing support. One attendant, a young man named Carlos, raised his hand. "I always thought stepping in could make things worse, but now I see how just being present can send a signal." Emily nodded, a sense of accomplishment swelling in her chest. "Exactly. It's about showing passengers that they aren't alone, that we're aware, and that we care." Jasmine, meanwhile, received an invitation to attend one of the training sessions. She sat in the back, observing as crew members practiced scenarios that mirrored what she had experienced. The exercises were eye-opening. She watched as attendants role-played both passengers and crew, learning to read body language and handle difficult situations with grace and subtlety. During the Condé session, Monica invited Jasmine to share her perspective. Standing up, Jasmine felt the eyes of the room on her, but it no longer filled her with anxiety. It filled her with purpose. "I just want to say that as a passenger, feeling seen can make all the difference," Jasmine began. "On Flight 327, Emily's awareness changed everything for me. It's not about making grand gestures, it's about paying attention and acting with empathy. That's what turns a moment of fear into one of support." The room was quiet as she spoke, the message sinking in. A few crew members exchanged looks that spoke of understanding and determination. Emily caught Jasmine's eye, a smile passing between them like a shared secret. The positive response to the training program spread beyond the airline. Other companies in the industry took note, reaching out to learn about the curriculum and requesting insights for their own crew protocols. Emily and Monica found themselves presenting at industry conferences, where they spoke alongside experts on the importance of training staff to handle nuanced situations involving bias and harassment. At one such conference, Emily stood in front of a room of unfamiliar faces, speaking with the confidence she'd built over months of sharing her story. What happened on Flight 327 was a reminder that vigilance is not just about safety. It's about creating a space where everyone feels protected, she said. And sometimes that starts with one person choosing to act. The ripple effects of the training reached passengers too. One evening, while waiting for a delayed flight, Emily noticed a teenage girl looking around nervously, her hand clutching her backpack in a familiar way. Emily approached with a smile. "Are you okay? Need any help?" The girl's eyes brightened with relief. "Just nervous about flying alone," she admitted. Emily's smile widened. "I get that. But you're not alone up there. The crew's here to make sure you're safe and comfortable. Always." The girl nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Emily returned to her seat, the interaction sparking a sense of continuity, a thread that connected that small act to the larger movement she had become a part of. Jasmine's advocacy work expanded as well. She partnered with Voices for Unity, a nonprofit that worked to address discrimination in public spaces. The organization helped her organize workshops and speaking events, sharing her story and helping others learn how to support one another in challenging situations. One day, Jasmine stood in front of a group at a community center, sharing the lessons she had learned. "I used to believe that staying silent was safer, that if I just endured, it would pass. But that flight and the people who stepped up showed me that silence can be isolating, and that support, even when quiet, can be powerful." As she spoke, she caught sight of a young man in the back, nodding along with her words. He approached her afterward, saying, "Hearing you today makes me feel like I can finally tell my own story." Jasmine's heart lifted. The fear and tension from that flight had been real and painful, but it had also led to moments like this. Moments that made the journey worthwhile. The sun set behind the cityscape, casting long golden streaks over the airline headquarters as employees filtered out. Conversations trailing off into the evening. Emily lingered in the office, reviewing notes from the latest training session. The room, once buzzing with energy, now felt quieter. The only sounds the rustle of paper and the faint hum of the heating system. She was lost in thought when Monica Lewis knocked on the doorframe. "Hey, you're still here?" Monica asked, her tone soft with concern. "Yeah," Emily said, rubbing her temple. "Just going over some feedback. I want to make sure we're covering everything that could come up in real situations." Monica stepped inside, her eyes thoughtful. "You've been putting so much into this. You know it's okay to take a breath, too." Emily smiled, grateful for the reminder. "I know, but this feels bigger than just one training program. It's about changing how we approach things, making sure people know when and how to step in." Monica's gaze softened. "And you're doing that? Trust me, Emily, you're making a difference." The words carried weight, settling some of the tension Emily didn't realize she'd been holding. She gathered her things, feeling a renewed sense of determination. Meanwhile, Jasmine's schedule filled with workshops and community talks. She was building connections with people who shared similar stories, individuals who felt emboldened by hearing about her experience. One day, after a presentation at a college in Brooklyn, a young woman approached her with tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm graduating soon, and I've dealt with this kind of thing my whole life," the woman said, her voice tight with emotion. "Listening to you, I finally feel like I can speak up when it happens again." Jasmine reached out, placing a gentle hand on the woman's arm. "You're not alone," she said, "and speaking up can be scary, but it's how we begin to change things." The woman nodded, wiping her eyes and smiling through the tears. Jasmine's heart swelled. The connections she was forming felt powerful, the echoes of Flight 327 evolving into a chorus of resilience and shared strength. The momentum from the new training program at the airline continued. Reports from flights around the country indicated that more crew members were stepping in when needed, not just during overt incidents, but in the quieter, more insidious moments when passengers felt uneasy or marginalized. Feedback poured in through emails and staff meetings, revealing how even subtle interventions had improved the atmosphere on flights. Emily sat at her kitchen table one evening, reading a message from a flight attendant she didn't know personally. "Emily, I was skeptical at first, but I had a passenger last week who looked distressed. sitting alone and fidgeting. I remembered what you said about showing presence, so I simply asked if she needed anything. She smiled, and I could tell it mattered. Thank you for reminding us that even small actions can make a big difference. Emily felt a warmth spread through her, a reassurance that the path she was on was the right one. It wasn't just about policies or procedures, it was about creating a culture of support. Jasmine and Emily's paths crossed again at a large public panel hosted by the airline and Voices for Unity. The event drew a crowd of employees, community leaders, and passengers who had heard about Flight 327 and its aftermath. The room was alive with anticipation, buzzing with conversations about change and what it meant to be allies in shared spaces. Emily sat on the stage, microphone in hand, scanning the audience. She spotted familiar faces: Monica, John Turner, Lucy, and felt a surge of comfort. Jasmine sat beside her, poised and confident, the nervous energy of their first meeting long replaced by a quiet strength. The moderator began, introducing each speaker and laying out the theme: How we stand together in moments that matter. When it was Jasmine's turn to speak, she leaned into the microphone, her voice clear. On that flight, I felt isolated and vulnerable. But when Emily intervened, it reminded me that we're never truly alone. It was a small act, but it changed everything for me. And now it's changing things for so many others. The applause that followed was genuine and prolonged, filling the space with shared appreciation. When it was Emily's turn, she spoke about the power of collective awareness. One of the most important lessons I've learned is that supporting others isn't always loud or heroic. Sometimes it's about being present, observing, and acting with empathy. These are things we can all do. After the panel, people lingered to talk, share stories, and exchange contact information. The event felt like the culmination of so many moments: the initial tension of the flight, the quiet resilience of Jasmine, the gradual shift in awareness among the crew, and the evolution of Emily's role from flight attendant to advocate. Lucy caught up with them, her face flushed with excitement. "You two were amazing up there," she said, hugging Emily and Jasmine in turn. "It's like watching a seed grow into a whole garden." Jasmine laughed, the sound light and free. "It feels that way, doesn't it?" John Turner approached, his usually stern expression softened with pride. "I've been in this industry a long time, and I can't remember a time when something like this sparked so much meaningful change," he said. "You've set a new standard, and I think we're all better for it." Emily felt her eyes prickle with tears, but blinked them away. "It's all of us, John. It only works if we're all committed." They stood together, a small group that had once shared the confined space of a plane cabin, now standing in a room filled with people who understood the significance of their choices. The atmosphere was hopeful, a promise of continued growth and shared responsibility. The weeks turned into months, and the changes rooted deeper. The airline rolled out its updated training program to all its branches, and other carriers began to adopt similar policies. Emily balanced her regular flights with speaking engagements, finding fulfillment in both. She loved the feeling of taking off, the sky opening up above her, but she also cherished the connections she made on the ground, sharing her experiences and hearing from others who were inspired by her story. Jasmine, too, kept moving forward. She finished her social work studies and started working with a community organization focused on supporting young people facing discrimination. The lessons she'd learned on Flight 327 informed her work, giving her a unique perspective that resonated with the people she helped. One evening, Emily and Jasmine met at a cafe near the community center where Jasmine now worked. The air was crisp, the scent of fall in the wind. They talked about their busy schedules, their future plans, and how far they'd come since that day in the cabin. "You know," Jasmine said, sipping her tea, "I used to think that courage was about grand gestures. But now I see that it's also in the quiet moments, like you walking past my seat and making eye contact when I needed it most." Emily smiled, the warmth of the memory softening the sharp edges of that day. "And I used to think my job was just about safety and comfort. But it's so much more. It's about people." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the hum of the cafe around them. both feeling the echoes of the journey they'd shared and the strength they'd found in one another. The atmosphere at the airline's main office was charged with anticipation. The results of the first full-scale rollout of the new training programs were due, and Emily, Monica, and several other senior crew members had gathered to review the data. The past months had been a whirlwind of change, each step measured, each result monitored closely. Monica stood at the head of the room, holding a report in her hands, the corners of her mouth twitching with restrained excitement. "The feedback from the first 3 months of the program is in," she announced, "and it's better than we could have hoped." Emily shifted in her seat, nerves and anticipation coiling in her chest. The room buzzed as Monica began to read out highlights. Crew members felt more confident intervening in tense situations. Reports of positive interactions with passengers were up, and more than 80% of attendants reported feeling empowered to step up when needed. One attendant's anonymous comment stood out. "Knowing that the airline supports us when we act with empathy has changed how I approach every flight. It's not just a job anymore, it's a responsibility." The words resonated deeply with Emily. She glanced around the room, seeing nods of agreement and expressions of pride on the faces of her colleagues. John Turner, who had been listening quietly from the back of the room, cleared his throat. "This is what we set out to achieve," he said. "But this is only the beginning. Let's keep building on it." Jasmine was at her desk at the community center, sorting through event flyers for upcoming workshops. A knock on the open door brought her attention to her supervisor, a kind-faced woman named Patricia. "Hey, Jasmine, there's someone here to see you," Patricia said, nodding toward the entrance. Jasmine stood, smoothing her blouse as she walked out. A young woman, maybe 20, with curly hair pulled back into a loose bun, stood nervously by the reception desk. When Jasmine approached, the girl's eyes lit up with recognition. "Hi, I'm Maya," she said, her voice tentative. "I came to one of your talks last month. I just wanted to tell you that it really stuck with me. I had a similar experience at school, and I finally spoke up about it." Jasmine felt a rush of warmth and pride. "Maya, that's incredible! Speaking up isn't easy, but it makes a difference. Not just for you, but for others who see it." Maya nodded, her expression softening. "I didn't think anyone would understand. But you do, and it helped me realize that I'm not alone." They talked for a while, Maya's story blending seamlessly with those Jasmine had come to know well. When they finished, Jasmine walked back to her desk, her heart full. This was why she did it. Why she pushed through the anxiety of standing in front of rooms full of strangers. For moments like this, where the shared experience of speaking out created ripples of change. As Jasmine's advocacy grew, so did the invitations. She was asked to join a city council panel discussing public safety and community support. The audience included educators, local leaders, and members of various advocacy groups. Emily attended, sitting near the back, her presence a quiet testament to the bond they had formed. The panel discussion flowed between stories of discrimination, strategies for bystander intervention, and the importance of community solidarity. When it was Jasmine's turn, she spoke with conviction. "Courage isn't just for those who are loud or bold by nature. It's for anyone who chooses to act when it's easier to stay silent," she said. "And when we stand together, even in the small moments, we create an environment where silence loses its power." Emily felt a sense of pride swell within her. She thought of the long flights, the quiet observations, the subtle ways she had always tried to make passengers feel safe. And now, seeing Jasmine take those moments and turn them into a movement made the weight of their shared experience feel purposeful. After the event, Emily approached Jasmine, who was surrounded by attendees eager to talk. When their eyes met, Jasmine's face lit up. She excused herself from the group and walked over. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said, a touch of surprise in her voice. "I wouldn't miss it," Emily replied. "You were incredible up there." Jasmine's smile grew. "I couldn't have done this without you, you know." Emily shook her head. "You were always capable, Jasmine. I just gave you a nudge when you needed it." Emily returned to her regular flights with a renewed sense of purpose. The next few weeks were filled with routine trips, yet each one carried a subtle difference. She noticed passengers engaging more with each other, small acts of kindness and connection that hadn't been as common before. It felt as if the lessons from Flight 327 were filtering through the cracks, subtly shifting the culture on each flight. One day, during a layover in Denver, Emily sat with Lucy and Alex at a cafe in the terminal. The conversation shifted to their most recent flights and how the training was making a difference. "I had a passenger yesterday who looked really anxious," Alex said, stirring his coffee. "I just checked in with him a few times, and by the end of the flight, he thanked me for noticing. It was small, but I think it helped." Lucy nodded. "It's funny how we used to just focus on the big, obvious things, seatbelts, trays, turbulence. Now it's the quiet observations that matter just as much." Emily listened, a smile tugging at her lips. "It's the ripple effect," she said. "We never know how far it'll go, but it starts with us." Back in New York, Jasmine found herself in the midst of planning a large event at the community center. It would be a day of workshops and panels on community resilience, featuring speakers who had their own stories of stepping up when it mattered. Jasmine reached out to Emily with an invitation to join as a guest speaker. On the day of the event, the community center buzzed with energy. Attendees filled the rooms, from teenagers with curious eyes to adults who had stories etched in their expressions. Emily stood at the entrance, taking in the scene before joining Jasmine at the front. When it was time for their session, Emily and Jasmine spoke together, their conversation blending the perspectives of a witness and a survivor. They recounted the small moments on Flight 327, Emily's watchful eye, the courage it took for Jasmine to accept help, and the way the crew's support had shifted an otherwise dark experience. "It's about being aware and choosing to act, even in small ways," Emily said, glancing at the crowd. "That's how we create safer spaces." Jasmine added, "And it's how we remind each other that we're not alone." The audience listened intently, the air thick with the realization that the lessons from that flight belonged to all of them. Afterward, people approached to share their own stories, their words a patchwork of shared fears and newfound hope. As evening fell, the event wound down. The last of the attendees left with brochures and smiles, conversations carrying into the street. Jasmine and Emily sat on a bench outside, the autumn air cool but pleasant. "Did you ever think we'd be here?" Jasmine asked, looking up at the stars. Emily followed her gaze, the sky clear and vast. "No, but I'm glad we are." Jasmine nodded, a quiet smile on her lips. "Me too." They sat in companionable silence, the streetlights casting long, soft shadows. The journey from that moment of fear on Flight 327 to this evening of shared stories had been long and filled with challenges. But as they sat together, the echoes of support and courage felt like a promise that whatever came next, they would face it, and they would continue to share their stories. The success of the community event lingered with Emily as she boarded her next flight. The cabin hummed with pre-flight activity, passengers settling in and chatting softly. There was an ease to the moment, a sense of calm that reminded her why she loved this job. Yet, beneath the routine, there was also the awareness that every flight carried its own stories and moments. As she moved down the aisle, helping passengers with bags and offering smiles, Emily felt a subtle shift in how she approached her duties. Every nod and quiet reassurance seemed to carry more meaning, woven with the lessons from Flight 327. The small moments had become more significant, and she found herself more attuned to the energy around her. An older woman in 22B, who fidgeted nervously with her seatbelt, caught Emily's eye. Emily paused and leaned in. "Is this your first flight in a while?" she asked, her tone gentle. The woman's eyes brightened, a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Yes, dear. It's been years, and I'm a bit nervous." Emily smiled. "Well, you're in good hands. I'll be right here if you need anything." The woman's shoulders relaxed, and she nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. Moments like these, Emily thought, were where real vigilance started, not just in emergencies, but in the quiet acts of presence that set the tone for everything that followed. Jasmine's work at the community center deepened as she expanded her role from speaker to mentor. She coordinated workshops and partnered with local schools to create programs for young people to learn about advocacy and allyship. It was fulfilling work, though not without its challenges. There were days when progress felt slow, when the stories she heard reminded her of the difficult reality of systemic issues. But those moments were countered by the breakthroughs: the teenager who found their voice, the adult who realized they could change the narrative in their workplace. One afternoon, Jasmine received an email that made her pause. It was from a flight attendant at another airline who had read about her story in a training manual. The message was brief but heartfelt. "Your story changed how I approached a situation on my flight last week. Thank you for being brave enough to share it." Jasmine closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. The story of Flight 327 had taken on a life of its own, reaching places she never imagined. It wasn't just her story now, it was part of a larger movement that others could draw strength from. A few months later, Emily was invited to participate in a panel at a National Aviation Safety Conference. It was the kind of event she would have avoided a year ago, preferring the quiet confidence of her work over public recognition. But things had changed. The journey from that tense flight to now had taught her that speaking up, sharing experiences, and standing by others could amplify change. As she sat on the stage, the room filled with industry professionals, Emily felt a familiar flutter of nerves. The moderator introduced her as one of the key figures in shaping current airline safety and empathy protocols. The words were humbling, but they also carried the weight of the responsibility she'd come to embrace. During the discussion, Emily shared stories from her flights and training sessions, emphasizing the importance of subtle observations and empathetic actions. "Our job isn't just about what we do when the seatbelt sign is on or off," she said. "It's about recognizing that every passenger, every interaction, has the potential to change the atmosphere. We're there to guide and, when necessary, to protect. Not just physically, but emotionally." Jasmine sat in the audience, having traveled to the conference to support Emily. She listened as Emily spoke, pride welling up as she saw the attentive faces of the attendees. The conversation shifted as a question was directed to the panel. How do we ensure that empathy becomes part of standard protocol? Not just an ideal? Emily's response was immediate and sure. It starts with training, yes, but more than that, it starts with culture. When crew members see empathy valued at every level, they know it's not just policy, it's the fabric of our work. The applause that followed was genuine, a recognition that these were not just words, but the principles guiding a new chapter in airline service. Jasmine felt the room's energy shift, a tangible sign that people were beginning to see that safety was as much about human connection as it was about technical expertise. After the conference, Emily and Jasmine found themselves walking through the city, the crisp air hinting at the arrival of winter. They stopped at a coffee shop, the warm glow from the inside, a welcome break from the chill. Sitting at a small corner table, they sipped their drinks, the steam curling between them. "Do you ever think about how far this has come?" Jasmine asked, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "All the time," Emily said, a soft smile crossing her face. "I never expected that flight to change so much. But seeing you up there, hearing your voice reach people, it makes all the hard parts worth it." Jasmine's eyes met Emily's, gratitude clear in their depths. "You know, for a long time, I thought strength was about never showing fear. But you showed me that strength can be in watching out for someone else, even if it means taking a risk." Emily's heart swelled. "And you taught me that speaking out isn't just brave, it's necessary." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey settling comfortably between them. It wasn't just about what they had done on Flight 327 or the training programs or the talks. It was about the understanding that empathy and vigilance were things they carried with them, shaping their actions and interactions far beyond that day. The airline's enhanced training programs continued to spread to other industries, becoming a case study for how organizations could integrate empathy into safety protocols. Monica, who had championed the initiative from the start, shared updates with Emily and the training team regularly. "I just got a report," Monica said one day over the phone. "We're seeing similar programs being adopted in hospitality and public transportation. What started with one flight is turning into a broader movement." Emily felt a surge of pride. The idea that one moment, one choice, could spark change across so many areas reinforced her belief in the power of shared responsibility. Months later, Jasmine stood on the steps of a local university, having just given a guest lecture to a class of future social workers. A young man with a notebook in hand caught up to her as she descended. "Miss Reed, I wanted to thank you for today," he said, slightly out of breath. "Hearing your story made me realize that empathy isn't just something you feel. It's something you do." Jasmine smiled, the words echoing the journey she'd been on since that day on Flight 327. "It is," she said, "and when you do it, it spreads." The influence of the training program spread beyond the airline industry, gaining the attention of public service organizations and educational institutions. Articles about how airlines were leading the way in integrating empathy into professional training appeared in industry publications and online platforms, sparking a wave of interest. One afternoon, Emily received an invitation to speak at a conference for public safety professionals. It was titled Empathy in Action: Bridging Safety and Humanity. The conference aimed to explore how incorporating empathy could transform not just airlines, but any field that dealt with public interactions. Standing in front of a diverse audience of first responders, transit workers, and educators, Emily felt a sense of purpose that transcended the cabin of an airplane. She shared stories not just from Flight 327, but from her years of observing passengers and small acts that changed the course of her work. "When we pay attention, we create ripples," Emily said, her voice strong. "And those ripples reach further than we ever anticipate." The response was overwhelming. Attendees lined up afterward to thank her, share their experiences, and discuss how they could apply these lessons to their own work environments. Meanwhile, Jasmine's involvement with Voices for Unity deepened. She became a featured speaker at national events and helped co-author educational material for schools about recognizing and confronting discrimination. The story of Flight 327 was a focal point in her presentations, used as a relatable example of how a single moment could become the catalyst for broader change. At one event, Jasmine stood on a stage illuminated by warm amber lights. The audience was composed of students, educators, and activists who had gathered to learn more about fostering safe environments. As Jasmine spoke, her words resonated deeply, filling the space with an energy that encouraged self-reflection. "One moment on a plane taught me that silence and complacency are not options," she said. "Every time we choose to act, to speak, to show kindness, we chip away at the isolation that so many people feel." Afterward, a student approached her, eyes bright with admiration. "I never thought about how much power there is in those small moments," they said. "It makes me want to be more aware, to be that person who steps up." Jasmine's heart swelled. This was why she kept going, why she shared her story, even when it brought back memories of fear. Because it was turning fear into empowerment, not just for herself, but for others. The airline continued to expand its training modules, partnering with external organizations to provide workshops that could be used across industries. Monica Lewis reached out to Emily one afternoon with exciting news. "We've been invited to partner with a major transportation network to adapt our training for their staff," she said. "It's a chance to show how empathy can be a foundational element in any customer-facing job." Emily felt the impact of Monica's words like a pulse. What had started as a flight attendant's instinctive response to protect a passenger had evolved into a comprehensive movement that touched lives far beyond the aisles of an aircraft. The collaboration took months of planning and testing. Emily, along with a team of facilitators, trained transit workers on how to observe, step in, and provide quiet reassurance. The program was tailored to the nuances of each setting, whether it was a crowded subway car or a long-distance bus ride. Jasmine joined these sessions as a guest speaker, sharing her story from Flight 327 to illustrate why the training mattered. One day, after a workshop for transit staff, a seasoned bus driver approached her. "I've been doing this job for 20 years, he said, his voice deep and weathered. "I've seen people at their best and their worst, and I never thought much about stepping in unless it was a serious problem. But you've made me realize that sometimes it's the small things that count. A nod, a look, a quiet, 'Are you okay?' It can change everything." Jasmine smiled, the shared understanding between them bridging the gap of their different experiences. "It can," she said, "and when more people know that, the world becomes a little safer." The legacy of Flight 327 was no longer just a memory, but an active force that shaped policy, training, and community interactions. Emily's career took on a new dimension. She continued flying, but now she also traveled to different cities to lead workshops and speak at conferences. The dual role invigorated her, connecting her love of travel with a deeper mission. On one of these trips, she found herself at a conference in Washington, D.C., where she was part of a panel discussing the future of safety training. The room was filled with leaders from various sectors: airlines, public transportation, hospitality, and education. Emily spoke about the importance of holistic safety training, where awareness and empathy were as important as physical safety measures. "Protocols alone don't create safety," she said. "It's the people who choose to see, listen, and act that make the difference." The applause that followed was steady and sincere. Emily felt the familiar warmth that came with seeing others understand and appreciate the message. As the panel concluded, several attendees approached her, eager to discuss collaborations and share how they could adapt these lessons in their own work. Jasmine's work reached new heights as she published her first article in a major magazine, detailing her journey from that initial moment of fear on Flight 327 to her current advocacy work. The piece was shared widely online, prompting discussions about the importance of community support and allyship in everyday life. One evening, as Jasmine scrolled through messages of support, one caught her attention. "Thank you for sharing your story. It reminded me that even in moments when I'm scared, I can still choose to be brave," she replied, her heart full. Bravery is in every choice we make to show up, for ourselves and others. The story of Flight 327 was no longer just a tale of one flight or two people. It had become a symbol of how acts of empathy, however small, could ripple outward and inspire others. The airline industry took note, making empathy-based training a new standard. Other sectors followed, adapting similar programs to teach their staff how to support one another and create safer, more inclusive spaces. One day, while on a flight back to New York, Emily found herself reflecting on the journey she and Jasmine had taken. The sky outside the window stretched endlessly, reminding her of the vast possibilities that lay ahead. The quiet courage it took to act in the moment had grown into something neither of them could have foreseen, a movement that encouraged vigilance, empathy, and strength in unity. As the plane began its descent, Emily looked out at the shimmering city below, a smile breaking across her face. They had started something, and that something was still growing, spreading across places and people who would carry the message forward. And that, she thought, was the greatest legacy of all. A year had passed since the story of Flight 327 first made headlines. In that time, the lives of Emily Carter and Jasmine Reed had evolved in ways they could never have predicted. What began as a tense moment on a routine flight had sparked a movement that rippled across industries and communities, changing both policy and personal perspectives. Emily stood at the window of her apartment in Chicago, watching as the sun set over the city. The warm light bathed the skyline, and for a moment she let herself take it all in. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a message from Monica. "Just read the latest article on the expansion of the training program. None of this would have happened without you and Jasmine." Emily's lips curved into a soft smile. She'd learned that her actions had an impact far beyond what she could see, extending into moments and places she might never know. And while the attention had been overwhelming at first, she'd come to embrace her role as both a flight attendant and an advocate for a better kind of safety, one that included empathy and vigilance as its core tenets. Jasmine was in New York, sitting at her desk in the community center, where she now worked full-time as an outreach coordinator. The walls were decorated with photos from past events, flyers for upcoming workshops, and quotes about courage and community. Her latest project was a collaboration with local schools, teaching young people how to identify and challenge discriminatory behavior in safe, constructive ways. Her phone chimed with a notification, an email from a teacher she'd partnered with. The students loved the workshop today. One of them came up after class and said it was the first time they felt like they could talk about what happened to them. Thank you for giving them that space. Jasmine felt a swell of pride and purpose. The workshop had been inspired by what she'd learned from Flight 327, from watching Emily's quiet courage and learning to find her own voice. The experience had taught her that courage could be nurtured in others, and that each act of speaking out or stepping in was a step toward broader change. Emily and Jasmine's paths crossed once more at an awards ceremony hosted by a national safety and advocacy organization. They had both been nominated for recognition. Emily for her role in pioneering new training approaches in the airline industry, and Jasmine for her community outreach and advocacy work. The room was filled with people whose stories mirrored their own, quiet heroes, advocates, and change-makers who had chosen to act when it mattered. When Emily's name was called, she walked to the podium, applause resonating through the hall. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady. "I'm honored to be here, but I want to share this moment with every flight attendant, every crew member, and every passenger who chooses to act with empathy. What we do in those small moments, when we choose to see, to listen, to care, can create ripples that change more than we ever know." When Jasmine's turn came, she stood before the audience, her heart full as she looked out at Emily and the others who had supported her journey. "This isn't just about what happened on one flight," she said. "It's about what happened after, and what continues to happen when we choose to stand together. It's about finding strength in community and showing that courage is contagious." After the ceremony, Emily and Jasmine found themselves outside under a sky filled with stars. The noise of the crowd inside was muted, replaced by the soft hum of the city at night. Emily took a deep breath, the cool air refreshing against her skin. "Can you believe all this?" Jasmine asked, a hint of disbelief in her voice. Emily chuckled, the sound light and full of relief. "No, not really. But I'm glad we're here." Jasmine nodded, a comfortable silence settling between them. The journey from the fear and tension of that flight to this moment of reflection had been anything but simple. Yet, here they were, stronger for it, their lives intertwined by shared moments of courage and a mutual promise to do better, be better. "Do you think about what might have happened if you hadn't acted that day?" Jasmine asked after a moment. "Sometimes," Emily admitted, "but what I focus on more is what did happen, how one decision can lead to so many others, and I think we're proof that it's worth it." They stood there for a while, not needing words to fill the space. The sky above seemed endless, full of possibilities, each star a reminder of how far they had come, and how many stories were yet to be written. The legacy of Flight 327 continued to inspire. Training programs based on Emily's and Jasmine's experiences were now part of standard operations not only in the airline industry, but also in schools, hospitals, and public services. Articles and case studies cited their journey as an example of how individual acts of empathy could drive systematic change. Jasmine's workshops expanded to other cities. Each one met with new faces and stories that added layers to the narrative she and Emily had started. People began to share their own experiences, creating a network of support and action that reached beyond what either of them could have imagined. Emily continued her work, flying regularly but also mentoring new flight attendants on the values that had shaped her journey. Every now and then, she would see passengers offering help to one another, or a fellow crew member taking the extra moment to connect, and she'd feel that familiar warmth, a reminder that the ripples were still moving, still reaching out in unseen ways. Years later, the story of Flight 327 had become more than just a memory. It was a testament to the power of empathy and action. It was taught in training sessions, discussed in classrooms, and used as an example of how people could make a difference in the quiet moments that mattered most. Emily and Jasmine stayed in touch, their friendship a symbol of how shared experiences could lead to shared missions. Every year, they'd meet on the anniversary of that flight, not to dwell on what had happened, but to celebrate how far they'd come and what they'd accomplished together. One year, as they sat in a cafe that had become their tradition, Emily raised her cup of coffee in a toast. To the flight that changed everything, Jasmine smiled, clinking her cup with Emily's. And to the moments that keep changing everything. They sipped in silence, the past and present intertwined, each knowing that courage wasn't just a single act, but a series of choices, made again and again, rippling outward to inspire others to do the same. Thank you for joining us on this journey of courage, empathy, and resilience. If you found this story inspiring, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends and community. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss out on more stories that spark thought, hope, and change. Your support helps us continue to share meaningful content. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.